Sweet. So today, let me pull up the chat. We're going to be talking about cartographic principles. So map making is both a science and an art. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about the art component to it. So we're going to start off with a little game of what's wrong with this picture. So take a look at this map and tell me what you think doesn't look quite right.
The legend says countries, but those are states. Oh, counties. Never mind. Sorry.
Counties, yeah. There is something kind of off about that, though.
Is it like it's only like focused on Florida and there's not data for the rest of the states or counties?
Yeah. Yes, I'll start a little text box here. So
Is there a title? Is the cities with population ranges, is that the title?
that is the title, yeah. What do you think of that title?
Kind of poor. I feel like it's not very specific and it has nothing to do with Florida. Exactly, you know?
Right. So add something about that in the title. So do you think Louisiana, Alabama, all of those states don't have any cities with a population less than 10,000?
They do, but it looks like they just ignored it.
Right.
It also looks like this is just an island and there's no actual land connecting to these other states. If you weren't familiar, you know, with this area.
Right. Yeah, so definitely specifying in Florida specifically would help with that. And you could probably just get rid of those extra states and zoom in on Florida specifically. And maybe show a light border if you wanted to.
It also doesn't show any years. So you have no idea like what the growth looks like and for what time period.
Yeah. Absolutely. Take a look at the legends and how the color of counties. Notice how the states are the same shade as the counties. That's not really something you want, because now it looks like Georgia is an entire county. Can anyone think of a title that might be better suited to this map?
Like Florida's city population ranges.
Yeah, so adding Florida, definitely.
Yeah.
Adding the year that the data was collected.
A city can't have like less than 100 people in like my opinion. So I feel like they should break it up a little
Maybe
bit.
townships or something. In 20, whatever year. Yeah, so these are all things to start taking into consideration as you're making your maps. So taking a closer look at this and some principles of design. With your title, you want it to say what the topic is. So in this case, that would be Florida cities, where you're showing, again, Florida, and then the temporal information. So like you all said, you need to add a year into that. So you want to be really specific with your title. Your map should stand alone. If you show it to someone who has no idea what you're showing on the map, they should be able to tell you what the map is trying to get across. You want your title to be very prominent, so make sure the text is pretty large compared to everything else on your map. They do a decent job of that here. I would say it could be even bigger. You also want to have a very clear legend. So in this case, having the same color for counties and states was a bad idea. You definitely want to have your legend really clearly associated with elements on your map. You don't necessarily need legend on the top of it. I think ArcGIS does that by default, but it's often really clear that your legend is a legend, and you can save space by not including that. It's also helpful to have a border around your map. In this instance, it's a little darker than you might want it to be. We're going to talk about figure ground today. And you want things that aren't prominent features on your map to fade into the ground a little bit more. So in GIS, this is called a neat line that goes around your map. And you might want to make that a little bit lighter so it fades into the ground more. Another really important component is your scale. There's a whole bunch of different kinds. You can have a visual scale, which is what's on this map. Showing physically the distance and what it's associated with in real distance. And then you can also have a verbal scale, which is like 1 inch equals 1,000 miles. So 1 inch on the map would be equivalent to 1,000 miles in the real thing. And then you can also have a numerical scale, which is a little more flexible because that can be associated with any units. So like 1 millimeter on the map would be 1,000 or 1,200,000 millimeters in the real world, which would come out to like 1.2 kilometers. So that can be useful if you're trying to reach a broader audience, like a global audience. But the first two are a little more straightforward. So it's important to keep your audience in mind when making these decisions. Also, a directional indicator can be helpful. It's not necessarily always required. Generally, north is assumed to be up. But if you do adjust your map at all and north is facing a different direction, you definitely want to include it. And also, if it's maybe an unfamiliar area to your reader, maybe not everyone knows where Florida is, then you'd want to include it to make sure they're oriented correctly. So this is all leading into cartographic design principles. So really important things to keep in mind while you're designing your map. There's a lot, and we're not going to touch on all of it today, but we're going to talk about understanding user requirements, so who your map is for and what they need your map to represent. Consideration of display format, so how you set up your title and your legend and all this formatting stuff on your map. A clear visual hierarchy, so making sure the most important parts stand out. Simplicity, making sure it's not too cluttered. Legibility, making sure it's readable, really important. Consistency, if you're showing multiple things on it, multiple symbols, make sure everything holds up and is consistent so that it's accurate. Oops. Accessibility, like could someone who's colorblind read your map? Could someone whose vision is not perfect read your map? You want to try to make your maps as accessible to as many people as possible. And then also good composition, making it look pretty. We're going to focus on these 5 today, but definitely keep those other 3 in mind as well as you're making your maps. So firstly, for understanding user requirements, you want to really focus in on these 2 questions. What information does the map user require? And how will they be using the map? So what does your user want it to represent and who's going to be looking at it and how will they receive that information. Sorry, my computer's being kind of janky right now. So focusing on the needs of the user will allow the map design to really focus in on the elements that are most valuable. You're going to find that as you're making maps, you can show a lot of things, but you always want to relate back to those two questions and make sure that what you're showing is relevant and is going to be received well by the audience. It's also important to keep in mind that as you're both making and interpreting maps, that they are subject to bias. The way we see the world is different based on where you're from and what your biases are. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at these things. So for example, we have two different projections of the world here. The Mercator projection, which is really standard when you open ArcGIS Pro, that's the projection that your map shows up as if that's what you select. You're going to see this all the time. It's a really good projection for navigation because it orients you correctly. So like seafarers would use this projection and that's how it really originated. But it distorts the size of things closer to the poles and enlarges them, and it makes things smaller closer to the equator. So this makes the northern hemisphere of the world look much bigger than it actually is. Whereas with an equal area projection, like the Berman projection, you have things sized out more accurately. So like Africa looks much bigger, South America looks much bigger, Australia, parts of the southern hemisphere. And this adjusts how we see the world, right? So it's important to keep in mind who your audience is, what you're trying to show most accurately, what you want to be distorted. You're going to talk about projections much more in this class, so I don't want to get too far into it. But you can see even something as simple as taking the round world and trying to lay it out flat in different ways can really morph the way the map comes out. Your map could also look like this. I wouldn't recommend it, but the reason north is up is completely arbitrary. Like, why don't we have maps where north is down? And you can see how certain features are much more prominent when you lay it out this way. There's also Pacific-centered maps as opposed to Atlantic-centered, and that also adjusts the way you see the world. It puts Eastern Asia much more prominent, Australia much more prominent on the map as opposed to North and South America. So these are all things to keep in mind, the biases both of yourself and how you're representing your data and trying to make that as accurate as possible. But also when you're looking at maps, think about who's making it, what their biases might be, and how that might affect the maps they're making. Another important design principle is a clear visual hierarchy. So looking at this map, can anyone tell me what they think it's trying to show?
Is it like the cities of the UK?
Yeah. Anything else that seems important here?
The borders of the UK, not including Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely highlighted here.
The water bodies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the goal of this map is to give a context of Great Britain and how it's surrounded by the other countries and highlight the major cities. So you definitely picked up on the highlighted major cities, so they did a good job of that, making that text darker and bolder than the rest. But it does seem like the surrounding countries fell into the background a little bit. No one really picked up on that. So if you really want those to be a prominent feature, they might want to make that text a little darker or make the borders on other countries a little darker. But if that wasn't a huge priority for the map maker, then maybe this is just fine. But yeah, having the UK or Great Britain boldened like that definitely highlights it on the map. I would say if the water bodies aren't super important to the goal of this map, they could probably make that text a little lighter because it does stand out a lot. So the goal of this is to draw attention to certain elements, the ones that are most important to you, and let the rest sort of fall into the ground. So this is the whole idea of the figure ground concept. You want to manipulate what stands out on your map and what fades into the background. And there's a lot of ways you can do this, and it creates much more visual depth and contrast as opposed to having everything be bold black or like a gray part of the background. You can have different layers to it. And you want to consider what does jump out, make sure the most prominent features do, what falls back, and what isn't even part of your map, what fades off altogether. So there's a couple ways you can do this. One is by creating visual differences. So like how you saw on that map, using lighter gray for the countries and darker black for the cities helps the city stand out more against the background. So having greater visual differences from the ground helps the figure stand out more and focus more attention on it. You can also use different edges to differentiate the figure from the ground. Having weaker, less defined edges is going to cause something to fade into the ground, whereas really sharp defined edges are going to move your figure forward and make it more prominent. And then also layering. So having your most prominent and important features on top of all your other layers to the best of your ability is going to help it stand out. So for example, if you have grid lines, moving those grid lines behind your feature can help it stand out much more than if they were in front of it. Another way is using shape and size. Having enclosed figures really helps make it much more clearly a figure. Whereas with this picture on the left, it's hard to tell if the circles are your figure or if this sort of weird fidget ring shape is your figure. So having enclosed shapes where you want them to stand out is really important. Complex shapes can also draw more attention, so that's also something to keep in mind. And larger symbols will also draw more attention. The direction of your objects can also play into figure ground. So having the same orientation and heading in the same direction will draw the eye to see a figure as opposed to ground. So in the figure on the left, the ones in the differing direction fade into the ground a little bit more, whereas when they're all facing the same way, they all show up as figure. Also familiarity. So I know I flipped the map upside down and told you north could be down, but I wouldn't recommend it because no one's going to know what they're looking at. So in this case, we have Italy, and when it's flipped upside down, I would have never guessed that that was Italy. But when you put in the correct orientation, subjectively, you can definitely tell that that's Italy. So using familiar, recognizable shapes will make them also stand out as figure. Another really important part of design is differentiating your symbols. So you're going to use a lot of symbology. You already did in Lab 1 a little bit with your city populations. And you want to make sure that each level of symbology stands out from the next, and not just right next to each other, but if you have two symbols one level apart, all across from each other on the map, you still want to be able to tell them apart. So in these examples on the left, you would not be able to do that. There's not enough of a difference between those symbols. Whereas on the right, there is a substantial enough difference in size that you'll be able to pick them apart. This also applies with all different kinds of symbols. So not just point symbols like I just showed you, but also line symbols. You want to make the boldness substantial enough that you can tell them apart. Like in these examples on the bottom, you cannot differentiate these two lines, even though they're just one level apart. Whereas if you make the next bolder and the other one thinner, you're going to be able to differentiate them. This holds true for dashed lines too. A really neat trick for dashed lines is using different types of dashes, like in that bottom right sample. So that can be a really good way to differentiate lines. The one on the bottom most right, I wouldn't even say is a good example. I think the one line is way too light. So don't overdo it. Make sure everything still shows up when you're trying to also create differences in shading. And you can also have text symbols. So you want to make sure that the size of those text symbols is also distinguishable. So there's lots of different ways to represent data on your map. One of those ways is shape. What do we think about using these shapes to represent what this map is trying to show?
I guess it kind of works, but I would prefer a different symbol, maybe like color hues or something like that. Like because on the East Coast, the symbols are really like, bunched together, so it's kind of hard to indicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else about having different symbols representing these numerical categories? No? Okay. Well, Julia Rose kind of already got at it, but shape is not a good way to represent quantitative data. You want your symbology to be representative of the data you're trying to show. And in this case, this really doesn't align with quantitative data. It's more categorical. So like if you were trying to show the most prominent crop in each state, then this might be a good example. But like Julia Rose pointed out, it does get a little jumbled. So hue might be a better way of showing this, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But in general, shape is better for categorical data over quantitative data. So this would be a better way of representing this map, having a large symbol associated with the largest numerical group and then a really small symbol associated with the smallest numerical group. And so in this way, you look at the map and you think, okay, the states with the largest circle have the most active hate groups. This is a really disappointing map, but it's much better to use these sort of graduated symbols for quantitative data over just shape. Another way to do this is using choropleth maps. So shading your areas with darker shades to represent more or lighter shades to represent less. What do you think of this Wisconsin farm density map?
It's the opposite. So the darker shades representing less, which I feel like is not what I would immediately think of. I think the dark is more.
Right, it's not super intuitive, so it would be better to have this reversed. And also having the smallest values on the top of your legend is also a little backwards. You generally want to have the smallest values at the bottom and then build up to the higher values. So this map is just a little backwards. What about this map on the right? I'm seeing some head nods. Looks good. We definitely have it ordered in a way that's more intuitive. makes a little more sense to the reader. Visually, does it look okay?
The borders are kind of merging together. You don't know where it begins or ends.
Yeah, exactly. So you have this blob here that looks like one county because it blends in with the borders. So you want to make sure that the colors you use are different from the colors of your borders so they don't all blend together. Another thing with this map is using white to represent more than 0 or having data. White usually means a lack of data. So it would be better to have a really light gray or something for your lowest values here. What do you think of this map? Is this having different colors for these different values a good way to represent the data?
I would say that instead of doing different colors, it might be better to do the same color with different strengths of colors so that you can actually see that the purple is different than the green, because there's nothing specifically different between purple and green.
Right.
Also,
Yeah,
if
sort
someone
of
was
like,
colorblind
sorry,
too,
what, Tyler?
if someone was colorblind, they wouldn't be able to kind of differentiate which ones.
Mhm. Yeah,
I don't really understand how a map of the US ties into the title specifically. So I don't know if maybe they're referencing like US soldiers from these different states, or if maybe there was just like confusion in general.
yeah, absolutely. A more specific title here would be really beneficial. Kiri, you nailed it. Different hues would definitely be better in this instance. So sort of like what we discussed with having different shapes represent these numerical categories, having different hues representing, so hue is like the color type. Having that represent this data doesn't necessarily apply, as well as using, different color values. So hue is not necessarily a good way to represent quantitative data, just like shapes aren't, because green is not more than blue, right? They're different in type. Whereas for color value, having a darker value of the same hue for higher numerical categories and having a lighter color for lower numerical categories can make more sense to your reader. So what do you think of this map? Does that look a little better, more intuitive? Yeah, Mia says so much better. Definitely.
I feel like they could have used maybe a bigger difference in color between 13 and 25 and 26 and 41. Seems a little hard to differentiate those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if they weren't directly next to each other, you might not be able to tell those apart. So that is definitely something to keep in mind.
Would you recommend that we use, like, if we were to use a color sample like this and we maybe couldn't find something better, that we use like a slashed line for the 16 through 12 to distinguish between like those different shades of yellow, or is adding a pattern more confusing?
You can use a pattern, and that can be helpful sometimes, especially if you're trying to show multiple categories that might help you distinguish it. It can make your map look really busy though. So if you're trying to symbolize a lot of features, I would be wary of doing that because it can just start to look crowded. But it's pretty easy to play around with symbology on ArcGIS Pro once you get more comfortable with it. So you can sort of try out lots of things and see what looks best. It's somewhat subjective. I would also recommend showing a friend and see if they understand what you're trying to show. But you have to sort of play around with it and see what looks best for what you're trying to represent. one issue I'm noticing with this, I don't know if that's a typo, but 16 to 12 for the lowest category doesn't work. It overlaps with the next category. So make sure that your legends are accurate and don't have typos like that. Color value, like color hue, doesn't work so much for quantitative data. Color value doesn't really work for categorical data. Looking at this map, it implies that the states in which Obama won have more of something than the states in which McCain won for the 2008 election, rather than being different in type. So it would be better to use different hues like green or red and blue, like you typically see in maps after elections, would be a better way of representing that data. Another important thing to keep in mind on your maps is simplicity. So take a look at this map and let me know what you think. Is it clear what they're trying to show here?
They could make the line like showing that hurricane a little more bolder or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking back to that figure ground concept, these arrows fade into the ground a little bit. So making these arrows bolder, maybe darker, or making the water features lighter could really help bring it more into the figure as opposed to the ground. Otherwise, it looks pretty clear. They're showing the path of a storm and there's not too much going on. It's pretty clear where the storm is moving. So simplicity can be really beneficial for extending a clear message with your map. You can show a lot. As you get more data sets, you're going to see that they'll have the opportunity to symbolize 20 different things on one map. Don't do that. Make sure that you are relating back to the goal of your map and that what you're showing and what you're symbolizing and the features you're labeling all relate back to the goal and what the user wants to represent. There's a couple ways to simplify things. One is basic simplification. So it sort of reduces clutter on your map. It enhances visibility. So for example, if you have a shoreline, they can do a lot. They move around, they go in and out. But that's going to look really bumpy and cluttered on your map. And so you can sort of smooth that out and show less of that bumpiness and just kind of create a smooth line that follows the shape of it. And that will look much neater on your map. Another way of a category of simplification is smoothing. So if you have something that's really angular, you can kind of smooth the edges of it to look a little less harsh on the eye. But you do lose a little bit of your accuracy and location when you do that. So you want to ask yourself a lot of questions before you do these things. For simplification, how simplified can a feature be and still be recognized? Like if you're zoomed really far out on a map, you might represent a river with just a straight line. You might not show the two coastlines. You probably don't want to show the two coastlines. But you would still recognize that as a river if you make it blue, that sort of thing. And that would be a method of simplification. And then if you zoom in much further, you might simplify less and show both of the coastlines of the river. You want to ask yourself if the removal of detail removes vital information. Can you still tell what it is when you do that simplification? Does it make it more noticeable? Does it stand out more if you want it to stand out more? And does it make the map look less cluttered? And that's one of the main goals of simplification, is making the map easier on the eye, less cluttered looking. With smoothing, you want to ask how much you can smooth a feature without it losing its character. So you don't want to mess up the location of things too much. You want it to still look like what it's supposed to represent. So does it look more, or is it more difficult or easier to recognize after you do that effect? If it's more difficult to recognize, you might want to rethink that smoothing. And also, again, does it make the map look less cluttered looking? So these are aesthetic decisions that you make to make your message of your map clearer and make it a little easier on the eye. So again, it's both an art and a science, map making. The last really important thing with map making is legibility. You need to be able to read your map. Otherwise, it's not much use to anyone. So there's several ways you can make your maps more legible. One way is having your text and feature color match so that you can clearly tell what is associated with what. So in this example, making the road text red, along with making the roads red, or making the parks green, as well as the text labeling the parks. You can choose whether or not you use outlines. So this can help your figure stand out from the ground more. But maybe if you want something to be a little more part of the ground, you might not want to put a bold outline on there. So always keep that figure ground concept in the back of your mind and think what you want to stand out and how you can make it stand out more. And also using outlines can help make your features a little more clear to the viewer. You can also simplify your buildings and other features as well, but in this instance, it's buildings. The parks are also simplified. So you don't need to show every single individual building. You can amalgamate them and combine them into a little chunk of buildings to show it that way. As you zoom in really close, you might want to show individual buildings, but that's a decision you make as you adjust the scale of your map. Again, in the parks, you don't need to show every individual tree unless that's the goal of your map. You can just show a green shade outlining where your park is. Another nifty trick is creating a halo around your text. And that helps it stand out against if you have a busier background. So in this case, if you just had the red text, it probably wouldn't show up super well against a red background. So when you create your symbology, it gives you an option to create a halo, and you can make it any color you want, and that can help it stand out. What do you think of this map overall? Is it pretty legible? Are there any changes you would make to it? It's perfect.
So do you recommend using red words with those red lines, or would you use a different font color? You know, because also that something navigation on there, is it itching navigation? You know, you can kind of, you have to look at it really well to see what it says because it's kind of blended in.
Right. Yeah, so that's an instance where maybe you'd want to create a black halo around the text or something that helps it stand out a little more, because the blue, especially against that green background, is a little tough to read. And also when it overlaps with the little ponds there, it also becomes hard to read. So in that case, maybe make like a black halo, but having the blue text is helpful to make it clear that that's associated with the river here. And then again, with the red text on the red road, it does make it really nice and clear that this title is associated with the red road as opposed to one of the buildings being named Fergus Road or something like that. So it does create clarity having things color coded in this way. But you do want to make sure it doesn't blend in with the background. Like you don't want it to come at a cost of legibility. Anything else you would change about this map? Anything you really like? No strong feelings.
Where
Overall, it's
is
pretty
this?
good. What's that?
Where is this?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
That's a great question. This was one that Ryan came up with, so that's a great question. But yeah, these are all things to think about. And as you're looking at maps, maybe go on Google Maps and think about how that looks, what they do well, what they don't do well, what you can incorporate into your own maps. So that is about it for today. Does anyone have any questions on what we touched on today?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you found it helpful.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Yeah, and don't forget that your lab is due at midnight tonight, I believe. And I have office hours today if you need any help finishing that up. And you can kind of start thinking about these concepts that we covered today when you're making those maps, or if you finished that assignment already in your next assignment.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Emma, what time is your office hours today?
Today they are, to look at my own schedule, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m.
Oh, okay. Do you have time at 11 or do you have other people scheduled?
No, I have time at 11. Feel free to come
Oh,
by.
sweet. Okay, thanks. I'll see you at 11.
Sounds good. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, everyone. How do I stop?